Beauty for Ashes, and we began with Eve. She experienced great grief and sorrow over the loss of her first son. She experienced the fracturing of the beautiful creation. She experienced the loss of perfect relationship with her husband. All these things must have been a great burden and pain to her, especially because she would have known that she had a part in all that was now damaged in her life. She was not guiltless in this, neither was her husband. Remorse is the kind of pain that one experiences when they see the ramifications of their actions and mourn over what they have had part in causing. And yet in all of this, the comfort that we saw is that God did not abandon Eve in spite of her failings. He's faithful and He keeps His promise to fix this through Eve and her offspring. And we can see that promise move forward with Seth. But not all grief and pain can be explained by our own mistakes and failings. What about those who suffer because of another's actions? What about those who are innocent of any wrongdoing and yet still suffer? I've probably mentioned before that there's the one question that I see as somewhat unproductive that non-Christians commonly ask is, how can an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God allow innocents to suffer? And to a degree, it's not fair of me to call that question unproductive, because it is a valid question to have, but the reason why I think of it as unproductive isn't because it's not valid, but it's because if we're willing to look at God's Word and willing to listen, we find that there is an answer that God is willing to give us. And when we do, when we listen, we discover comfort and a foretaste of what God intends to do for all of the creation. And so for that, last week we talked about one who suffers because of their own doing, and that was Eve. Now we are going to look at one who suffers for what seems like no apparent reason. I have some friends that come from a different church tradition. I won't name it because we're not here to complain about other church traditions, but they are no longer active in their church, partially, very much so, because of an experience that they had when my friend's wife's father passed away. Her dad had been sick for a very long time. And in their church tradition, they've been told, if you pray hard enough and believe hard enough, he's going to get well. Well, he didn't get well. He died. Now, some of us might look at that and say, well, on the one hand, I do believe in miraculous healing. Part of my brain would go to and say, well, I guess it just wasn't God's best for the big picture. We'll use that term big picture a bit here in this message. The problem was in their church tradition, they began to feel isolated and excluded because what the unspoken thing was, well, since he didn't get well, you must not have believed hard enough or prayed hard enough. And it's one of the reasons why they believe, but they don't attend church much. And I have several friends that have what some people refer to, not sure how well I like this term, but they call it church hurt. And they have that. But that gets into the heart of what we're looking at today. Because here we have Job, and Job is a very interesting book of the Bible. There are some theologians and historians who believe that it is the oldest of all of them, because Genesis would have been written down later. Tradition says it's written by Moses, and if this goes back to Abraham's time, it would predate that. Won't get into all that. However, it is a very interesting book. And what we're first faced with is we have kind of like the opening act. Job is a good man. And he has all of these blessings. And back then, your wealth was counted in donkeys. And he's very wealthy. And it says that he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. A son for every day of the week, 3 daughters for, I won't speculate on what that's all about, but the numbers 7 and 3 are very important numbers. So, he has much, he has family. And then we go to Act 2. And it's kind of like all of a sudden this curtain has been opened up and we see a bit on the cosmic scene. And the first part of our answer to the question, why do good people suffer, is given to us here in Act 2. It says the accuser, the Satan, goes and God says to him, have you considered my servant Job? Now, there might be some people that might say, why did you point him out? Because that kind of sets him up for it. But God's trying to make a point to say, here is one who's blameless. And the Satan says, well, he's only that way because he's afraid what you might do to him if he ever behaves badly. So God essentially says, you know what? Let's see what happens. And the accuser is allowed to take everything away from Job. The next part that happens, first, it's all of his belongings and his family. And the second part is going to be his health and well-being. And I think I've kind of heard a joke before. It's like the one thing he's left is his wife, but then she just starts complaining at him. And so it's like, well, things just aren't going well for Job at all. And he's left with the question of why. Now we get the benefit of being able to see behind the curtain and see there is kind of a cosmic chess game going on, which might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, and there is room to discuss that and think on that as well. But Job doesn't know this. All of these things that are happening to Job, Job's just experiencing it, thinking, I don't think I did anything. The beautiful thing about the book of Job is that it is God's answer to the very question that seekers ask concerning suffering, but it may not be the answer that they were wanting. It declares that yes, good people can and do suffer. It's not always the result of our own sin. And it also tells us that God does not always chime in with a quick explanation of what's going on either, because once again, yes, we got to see behind the curtain, but Job didn't yet. Job will be left instead to, already mentioned his wife, and then now his friends come and they're kind of callous. Because they begin to argue with him, and that's what the bulk of the book is, 42 chapters. The bulk of the book is Job and his friends having an argument. Most of the time his friends saying, well, you must have done something wrong, Job, for all of this to happen because, good people don't have everything taken away like this. And Job insists and says, nope, I've not done anything wrong. And essentially it comes to the point of, as C.S. Lewis has put it, God is put in the dock, as it were. All of us have found ourselves in the place of Job at some point or another. and have wondered, why is this happening? What did I do? We look at the pain and the suffering of our world. We turn on the news just this morning to learn about new conflict, new war, and we're left to grieve, but without the odd satisfaction of blaming ourselves. Because, interestingly, when bad things happen to us, but we know it is because of some dumb decision that we made, there is a certain odd satisfaction in that, because at least logic is satisfied. You know, if I would go down to the boat and gamble away everything, including the mortgage on my house, and I lose everything, at least I can go home and say, well, I'm an idiot. But when you don't have that, it's actually harder to be an innocent person suffering than it is to be a guilty person suffering. And this, I think, is the place that so much of our world is in today. And we need to be able to be sensitive to that. And so that's why when the world asks the question, how can an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God allow good people to suffer? What we first need to do is practice patience and sympathy and empathy. But then also know God does give us an answer. Well, after much debate and frustration between Job and his friends, God finally speaks. As I said, God takes the stand. It's as if there's been this trial going on, and now God finally takes the witness stand. And interestingly, God does not answer Job's question, but instead, it's almost as if God gives Job a glimpse, just a tiny glimpse, of the big picture behind the curtain. It's almost like God takes Job aside and just says, let me show you something for a second, and pulls back the curtain and then walks back. Job's friends don't see it. They don't know necessarily what's gone on. But when Job comes back, Job is satisfied. Now, God in turn is angry at those who wish to blame Job for his suffering, and for essentially their accusations against God, saying, well, this is how God operates, and so, fess up. God says, no, that's not how I am. And what I think is really interesting is Job is then put in the priestly position to pray for his friends. And he is called on to be an intermediary between his friends who have spoken wrongly of God and God himself. That intermediary role, that priestly role, is the role that humans were designed for, the role of stewardship. And it's a foretaste of the role of Jesus that we will see, because in Hebrews we are told that Jesus is our great high priest. And in going to the cross, Jesus will act as the intermediary between God and humanity. Now, what can be difficult here for us is that God does not explain to Job that Satan had used him as a pawn to make a point. And Satan lost, by the way. But we get to have that explanation. And so, in many ways, the book of Job is a book that is written not so much for the benefit of Job, but it's for the benefit of everybody else. Because we get to have that explanation. Indirectly, the book of Job is telling us that there is a force for destruction and suffering in our world. And that force, it's not we want to be careful not to apply human motives to the accuser. But there is this force for destruction and suffering in our world, and that as the world was allowed to be fractured by sin that we introduced, that power of destruction and suffering has to some degree set up shop in the world, and it's not easily dislodged. That's not to say that every bit of innocent suffering in our world is caused by the devil poking them with a pitchfork, but that it is to say that there is an author for suffering in the world. And although he has been overthrown, he is still present. He has yet to be fully and finally dealt with. But in bringing restoration to Job, God is giving us all a foretaste of where the bigger story, that bigger story that I think God maybe gave a glimpse to Job of, where it is going. God does not inhibit suffering from occurring at all, but He is the answer to it. He is the one who brings healing and wholeness. Yes, indeed, the enemy does have power, and we cannot deny that, but God's power is the greater one. And what we see is that when Job acts as that intermediary for his friends, we see that everything is restored to him with interest, with one exception, and that is his children. He receives back the same number of children. Now, this is where I put caution mark here and say, this is Pastor Michael's opinion, this is not shared by all, and we don't have proof one way or the other on it. But my theory, my thought is that where it doesn't say, and he had 14 sons and 6 daughters now, but instead he still has 7 sons and 3 daughters. My belief, my thought, my theory is that God has brought back to life again his children that were lost. Maybe, maybe not, but that is my interpretation of it. But this healing that God brings to the brokenness will be illustrated many centuries later when another innocent man will go and suffer on a tree for the sins of others so that God's healing and wholeness might be released into the creation to begin the work of recreation. God, through Jesus, is taking the pain and brokenness of our lives and the whole world to the cross. And through Jesus' life-giving death and resurrection, He is bringing resurrection to all creation. He is taking the ashes of our suffering and giving us the beauty of new life in this world and the world to come. And that is the definition of what hope is all about. Amen.